Moving into my first apartment was supposed to be a step toward independence, a chance to prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was 22, fresh out of college, and couldn't afford to live completely by myself, so I rented a 2-bedroom place in a quiet part of town and put up an ad online looking for a roommate. 2 weeks later, I met Tyler. He seemed normal enough, early 30s, clean-cut, a quiet demeanor. He said he worked nights as a security guard and was looking for a place closer to his job. We met at a coffee shop, and after a brief chat, I decided to let him move in. That decision still haunts me. At first, everything seemed fine. Tyler kept to himself, and we rarely crossed paths due to his night shifts. He was polite but distant, never lingering for small talk. But there were little things, odd things, that began to stand out. For one, I noticed he always kept his bedroom door locked, even when he wasn't home. I figured it was just a habit, but something about it felt off. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, I'd sometimes hear muffled voices coming from his room, like he was talking to someone. I never saw anyone enter or leave, so I assumed he was on the phone. Still, it was strange, considering he didn't seem like the social type. The weirdest thing, though, was the mirror. A few days after Tyler moved in, I noticed he'd hung a large, antique mirror in the hallway outside his room. It was old, with an ornate, tarnished silver frame, and the glass was slightly warped, giving reflections a distorted, almost funhouse effect. When I asked him about it, he just said, "It's been in my family for years. It's important to me." I didn't press further, but something about that mirror made my skin crawl. One night, about 3 weeks after Tyler moved in, I came home from work to find the apartment unusually dark. Tyler's door was closed as usual, but there was no light coming from underneath it. I shrugged it off and went about my evening, cooking dinner and watching TV. Around midnight, I heard the voices again, muffled, low, and coming from his room. It sounded like an argument, but I couldn't make out the words. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept down the hallway, stopping just outside his door. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I held my breath, wondering if he'd heard me. Then suddenly the antique mirror creaked. I whipped around to face it, heart pounding. At first, I saw only my own distorted reflection staring back at me. But then something moved. In the corner of the mirror, behind my reflection, I saw a dark figure. It was tall and shadowy, with no distinct features, but it was there, standing in the hallway behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. The next morning, Tyler didn't come home. I told myself he was probably working overtime, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. That evening, after pacing the apartment for hours, I decided to check his room. His door was locked, of course, but I found a small set of keys on the kitchen counter. Keys I'd never seen before. One of them fit the lock. The room was sparse, a bed, a dresser, a nightstand. No personal photos, no decorations, nothing to make it feel lived in. But there were two things that stood out immediately. The first was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, metallic, like blood. The second was a small notebook sitting on the nightstand. I opened it, flipping through pages filled with messy, scrawled writing. Most of it didn't make sense, random words, phrases, and symbols. But a few sentences stood out. The mirror sees everything. Don't look too long. It needs someone new. At the bottom of one page, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He's coming." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed on the couch, the notebook clutched in my hands, jumping at every little noise. Around 3 a.m., I heard the creak again, the mirror. I forced myself to look toward the hallway. The antique mirror was there, its warped glass reflecting the dim light from the living room. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure was back, but this time, it wasn't standing behind me. It was inside the mirror. It pressed against the glass, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. I watched, frozen in terror, as it raised one long, bony hand and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it spoke. Its voice was low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together. I couldn't understand the words, but they sent a chill through my entire body. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but at some point, I bolted. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment, and drove to a motel on the other side of town. When I returned the next morning, Tyler's room was empty. The antique mirror was gone, along with all his belongings. It was as if he'd never been there. I called the landlord, asking if Tyler had mentioned moving out. She sounded confused, and told me no one named Tyler was ever on the lease. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer. Sometimes late at night, I wonder about Tyler. Who or what was he? Where did he go? And what was the thing in the mirror? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but one thing is certain. I'll never trust a stranger again. And I'll never, ever look into an antique mirror. There are moments in life where you question if reality itself has fractured, leaving you stranded in some distorted version of the world you knew. For me, that moment came one summer night in 2019, while staying at my parents' lake house deep in rural Michigan. What happened over the course of 3 nights changed my perception of safety, isolation, and human nature forever. It began innocuously enough. I'd just finished college and wanted a break from the city. My parents' lake house, surrounded by dense woods and sitting next to a calm, secluded lake, felt like the perfect escape. I'd visited the place countless times as a kid, so I was familiar with its every creek, every shadow. That familiarity gave me a false sense of comfort. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening fishing by the dock, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon before retreating inside to read. By 11 p.m., the house was silent except for the faint hum of crickets and frogs outside. Sleep came easily, the kind of deep rest that only total solitude can bring. But the second night was different. I was sitting in the living room around 10:30 p.m., scrolling through my phone with the TV on for background noise. The large windows that faced the backyard were partially open, letting in the cool night breeze. Beyond those windows was a black void of forest that swallowed all light. That's when I heard it, 3 distinct knocks on the back window. I froze. It wasn't a random noise or the wind. It was deliberate. Knuckles on glass. "Hello!" I called out instinctively, my voice shaky. No response. I stood up and inched closer to the window, heart pounding. Grabbing a flashlight from the table, I shone it out into the backyard. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and the faint shimmer of the lake in the distance. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon brushed against the window. But deep down I knew better. I locked all the doors and windows before heading to bed, leaving the lights on in the living room as a small comfort. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone's eyes were on me. I spent most of the day on edge, but nothing happened until night fell. It was around midnight when I decided to call it a night. I was in my bedroom, staring at my laptop, when I heard it again. 3 deliberate knocks, this time on the bedroom window. My blood turned to ice. Unlike the living room, my bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could reach the window without a ladder. I sat there, paralyzed, listening to the deafening silence that followed. Then, as if to taunt me, there was a scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across the glass. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. Silence. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but my signal was weak, and the call wouldn't go through. Panic set in as I grabbed a kitchen knife and barricaded myself in the bedroom closet. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the occasional sound of footsteps outside the house. When the sun rose, I cautiously stepped outside. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints, no ladder, nothing. It was as if I'd imagined it all. By now, I was too scared to stay another night, but I didn't have much of a choice. My car battery had died sometime during the day, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. That night, I barely slept. I stayed awake in the living room, clutching the knife and jumping at every sound. Around 2 a.m., I decided to try calling the police again. This time, I managed to get through. I told the dispatcher about the knocks, the sounds, and the feeling of being watched. They assured me someone would come by to check on the property, but it would take time, given how remote the house was. I hung up and waited in tense silence, staring out the window into the pitch-black woods. That's when I saw him. A man was standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely illuminated by the porch light. He wasn't moving, just watching the house. My breath caught in my throat as I stared back at him. He was tall, with a gaunt figure and unnaturally long arms. His face was obscured by a hood, but even from a distance, I could feel his gaze boring into me. I flicked the porch light on and off, hoping to scare him away. He didn't budge. Finally, I worked up the courage to yell, "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused, before taking a single step forward. That was enough to send me into full panic mode. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed my knife, and locked myself in the bathroom, praying the police would arrive soon. When the police finally showed up, the man was gone. They searched the property and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. They chalked it up to my imagination or an animal. But I knew what I'd seen. I left the lake house the next morning, my car battery mysteriously working again. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. I've shared this story with friends and family, but no one truly believes me. The only thing I know for certain is this: some places aren't as empty as they seem. And sometimes, when you're alone, you're not really alone at all.